I'd like to speak this afternoon about museums as social learning spaces. And actually, we didn't really even talk about what we were going to speak of until we were sort of sharing notes in the bathroom this morning. And I think you will see some really interesting synergies. But first, I want to thank Ida and frankly all of you for being so gracious. It's been a wonderful experience. Many people are saying, when are you leaving Denmark? Unfortunately, tomorrow morning. However, we've been here on the Danish marathon for a week, visiting many institutions. So at any rate, I look forward to sharing some thoughts with you, some things that I've been thinking about and working on in my time, and to give you a sense of what the way I plan to organize my thinking is I want to talk about the sociocultural context of museums. We've talked a lot about these places as being social places, but I want to talk about their actual sociocultural context, in particular in relationship to what we know about learning and the sociocultural nature of learning. And then I really want to advocate for this notion of museums as social learning spaces, places that groups themselves can interact and find meaning in as they relate to objects, places where facilitation by gifted educators, as I said yesterday, there's a great deal of expertise in our field around how to motivate interest and support people's learning, talk a little bit about that. And then I really also want to talk about social learning as outcome, as well as the context in which learning happens, and share some examples of that. And finally, and sort of intermixed in all of that, very relevant to what Jetta was just speaking about, want to talk about this notion of being of value and being relevant at, I would say, the level of the individual, the group, the community, and frankly, society, and I would say global society. So let's get started, all in 40 minutes. So the sociocultural context of museums. First of all, that sociocultural context arrives with every visitor who comes, actually whether they come in a group or not. You know, people are born into and develop within a cultural milieu, and that shapes their values, their beliefs, their ideas, their understandings. But as we've talked quite a bit over the last day or so, these are also societal institutions. And as actually Martha described so well this morning, they actually fit in to our societies in a particular position. And frankly, that is part of what I think we're wrestling with as we think about who is not coming, how we engage the unusual suspects. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And once again, what's very complicating in all of this is that the cultural differences, and when I say culture, I mean race, ethnicity, gender, you know, sexual preference, understanding of museums, connection to content. I'm thinking culture in a really, really big way. You know, I do a lot of work in science. Science is a huge culture, and we know that at times it's not the most inviting of cultures, particularly for women, particularly for you know, communities underrepresented in science, as it's very euphemistically talked about, at least in the US. What happens as visitors arrive, or in some cases choose not to arrive, is that they meet their sociocultural context comes into interaction, comes in sometimes to, oh wow, this is great, this is my tribe, and sometimes, oh my goodness, what's going on here, comes into that relationship with this institution and people who've designed that institution. who use their sets of values, beliefs, and their notion of what was worthy of keeping, caring for, and frankly, what they feel is important to share. But as we know with a lot of international research now, perhaps by some, and we're beginning to try to unpack that, what that means, the by some. So people have different perceptions, different experiences, in part based on that sociocultural context. If you're a frequent visitor, if you feel comfortable in the world of art or the world of science or the world of history, you come with a whole set of strategies for how to deal with these kinds of spaces. I love to walk into museums for the first time with children who are unfamiliar with museums. I had an experience with my niece of visiting the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and we walked in, and she looked up, and there was this big plane hanging from the ceiling. And she stopped, and I thought, if I've walked into that museum a number of times, and there's a plane hanging up. But that's not that common. I had a great, I love to talk to people in the bathroom. I had a great conversation with someone in this room about the first time she brought a group of young children to this museum, and what they loved was the bathroom and the sink. And she realized, well, I'll have to bring them back to ARC in another time, because they were so engaged with that particular experience. Not that I'm suggesting that that should be the case. The other thing I want to remind us of as we talk about this sociocultural stuff is that the data in the national survey said, guess what? These are social experiences. Only 7% of the people who were given the survey visit alone. And actually, in the case of the Copenhagen City Museum, actually that was 14%. And 46% of those people arrive in groups of 3 to 6, which, speaks to me of at least a typical family, and I'll come back to that. Less people arriving 7 to 10, and that's actually an issue as we think about some of our immigrant families that may come in larger groups. And this number has risen, but the proportion of larger groups has fallen. So some things to think about. And then something that's really, we tend to forget about. We've talked a lot about the museum, but let's think about that before time and that after time. Actually, something that popped out at me was that many of the people said the way they heard about the museum was from family, friends, and acquaintances. That sociocultural context continues. And frankly, people say, oh, this is a great place to take your family, or this is a great place for children, or this is a great place, I know your husband really likes this. You should go to this exhibit, it's great. A lot of the way we learn about these places is through word of mouth. And we're so lucky. And perhaps there's a reason why this museum is, these experiences are social, frankly, is that actually the nature of learning is very sociocultural itself. We learn by interacting with others through conversation, through doing things together. Our first learning unit, and if we want to think about evolution, this is very hardwired, is our family. It's an intergenerational group, and we learn a tremendous amount. As I mentioned yesterday afternoon, there's evidence also that actually our brains are wired for storytelling and narrative. Young children create scripts. And if any of you have been around young children, you ask them something, but the way they have to tell you about that in the in the context and format of a story. That's how we experience and make sense of the world. And so if we think about all the groups that might come, and I should have included tourist groups, but we've got intergenerational families, and frankly, families often at two stages. I was noticing as we were visiting museums, and I actually saw this on Sunday when we were at the Copenhagen City Museum, are families, but they're all adult families. They're adult children with parents. And we're seeing a lot of grandchildren with children. We know our school groups actually, well, we know our school groups are social, and I'll get to that later. We tend to not acknowledge that nor privilege the social nature of school groups. And, we know there are tag-alongs, and there are all adult groups, there are tourist groups. And once again, they're talking to one another, they're conversing. And John talked about identity building, and he talked about identity-related needs. But people also use these institutions to build collective identity as well, and family histories, and group histories, and friend histories. At any rate, and I guess the bottom line is, if we want to think in a sociocultural way, we need to think about them, not us. So a little bit more. I've talked about some of this. I'll go through this quickly. But groups bring a shared background and a history and a knowledge. And actually, if we think about school groups, they know one another. The kids know one another. The teachers, know the children. We're the strangers here. And in the case of families, they know one another. And we can learn a great deal by being a little more respectful of that sociocultural context that's brought. They understand to different degrees, but how each other learn. They often know their interests. In fact, honestly, if facilitators, and by the way, not all facilitators are parents, and not all parents are facilitators, but often if you talk to facilitators, they absolutely knew that their daughter loved dinosaurs, and that's why they came today, to actually support that interest. And I think that's a really important thing for us to understand. The other thing that we forget is that most people are choosing to be there. And there have been all these discussions about, oh, we don't want this to become Disney, which I absolutely agree, and I absolutely agree with Thomas. I think that Disney doesn't understand how to create layered, rich, deep experiences. But let's be respectful of our visitors. They know they are not at Disney. They chose to come to your house. And they feel like this is a place, as John said, where they can meet these identity-related needs. They actually find these places, for the most part, interesting and enjoyable. And I think it's really, really important that we embrace enjoyment, not as superficial, trivial sort of fun, but that learning is a joyful process when done and when allowed to actually do it in a more natural sort of way. And people see these places as places where they can have both this value-added experience of enjoyment and learning and meaning-making at the same time. And once again, I think what's very important, we've talked a lot about the experiences that we create for visitors. Sort of turning that around, we need to think about how we can support visitors in creating and constructing their own experiences. That's what they're there for, is to create their own experiences, how can the resources, the objects, the programs that we have be used to create rich experiences for all the groups that might use us. So so that's just sort of a introduction. Let's look at this Danish context. And in particular, I want to share with you, I was struck as I was looking at the survey data. There were some things that really popped out at me. First of all, there was this notion that we talked about quite a bit yesterday afternoon about the underrepresentation of youth and young adults. And it's great to see that's not so much the case at the City Museum, but they're significantly underrepresented. And I absolutely agree with John that some of that is developmental, but I also think there's a missed opportunity there. But something that I was really struck by is I looked at the core services data, and I looked at the 3 bottom lowest scores. And one was in the variety of museums sort of communication style. That was 3rd from the bottom. 2nd from the bottom was suitability for children. And then the bottom one was the possibility for active participation. And for me, I sort of saw that if I were doing something quantitative with these data, I might collapse those and create an index that I would call the experience score, because that really fits in. Particularly, it would be an experience score for families because of the suitability for children. And I just want to pose, I promised, I realized last night how foolish of me to promise that I would give some insights into the school visit situation. But anyway, I did say I would do that. I posit, perhaps, that the low experience scores perhaps contribute to less youth visiting and this sense of bad visits, dissatisfaction with school visits. So let's talk about that for a moment. But I want to be really, really clear. So the Danish context was your national survey data. This is not an issue only here in Denmark. Actually, what's really fascinating is if you talk to children about their learning, which we rarely talk to children themselves about their learning, they are very capable of talking to you about their learning. They know how they learn. They may say it and, well, I'm not good at school, but then if you say, well, what are you good at? They can talk to you, oh, I like to take things apart and figure out how to put them back together. I love puzzles. I mean, children are very able to think of themselves as learners. But when you talk to them, either in an open-ended way, and you just say, where are cool places to learn, or if you do sort of bring up museums, they talk about them being really interesting places. They love to look at the stuff. There are object people. They love the stuff. They think it's really cool. They love to figure out what that is. But consistently, in research that's been conducted in the US, in the UK, and in Australia, they actually say that they prefer to visit with their family than with schools. And these are some of the things that they mention. They say that they can look at what they're interested in, and they can talk to their friend, their sibling, their parent about what they're seeing. They actually feel that they get to do things when they're with their family. And by do things, I think they get to have that more engaging, more interactive experience. I don't think it's always that it's hands-on, but they get to have this extra level of engagement. And this should really, in some ways, trouble us, and it's a huge issue when we think of what Yetta was raising is that if you look at the correlation with adult use of museums, it reinforces this idea that school visits are bad because, or at least not very satisfying, because what correlates with an adult becoming a museum user is visiting as a child with your family, not as a child in a school group. And this really concerns me because for a very long time, museums have felt like, well, we need to work with school groups because that's how we'll reach those children whose families don't bring them to museums. And that may be true, but all that effort isn't necessarily resulting in these children becoming and feeling connected and reflected in the museum. So some possible ideas. These are just, these are based on research. Some research done by an Australian colleague of ours, where she found that what children were really looking for in a museum experience and a school visit experience was to have some purpose, to have choice, and to have ownership. And they wanted to be actively engaged. And one of the things she experimented with was children actually designing their own reasons for coming to the museum. And once again, not in an open-ended way. Actually, she initially started out by doing that. She said, you know, kids, generate some questions that you can answer at the museum. Well, what she discovered is they had questions that they couldn't answer at the museum. So we all know, don't empower a kid and then not be able to deliver. What she realized, I think what we all realize in our settings, is that we need to provide options, but we have an idea of what those options might be. And we scaffold that greatly so that a child will have a successful experience. There's a lot of effort around the world, and I understand from my, I was asking my group this morning, group 2, yay, group 2, about before, during, and after. There they are, yeah. Before, during, and after activity and experiences. I know actually the master teacher at Natarama, that's a practice there. The other thing they said is a lot of teachers don't always do that. But some of it may be the quality of the before and after. I know, and honestly, I helped to create these. My first job, I was an educator in a natural history museum. I mean, we gave people vocabulary lists, and we gave them ideas of what they might learn. All the stuff that John discovered isn't really that helpful. And instead, what she was experimenting with, as I said, is that there was some purpose that the children created. They went to the museum and used the museum and its resources to accomplish that. And then they needed to do something with it later. And there's research from the New York University program that focuses on museum education that school visits can be very rich, can be very powerful, but they need to be integrated within what children are actually learning about and doing. They can't be this one-off experience. And now I'm going to say something, and it's a little bit different from what we heard this morning. I think that we often rely too much on teachers and schools to help us design school visits. And I understand that opens a huge can of worms politically. In some cases, schools may not visit if you're not meeting the school's needs. But actually, I think we could learn a great deal from talking to children. And I had an idea that, I was thinking about those 14 to 18-year-olds who are in that 14 to 29 sample. John and I are working on a research project in Portland, and the first thing we did in that project is we hired high school aged youth and taught them how to collect data and how to become our informants, so to speak. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to talk to some of these kids who say they are bad school visits and talk to them about how they might talk to young children about the kinds of experiences they might enjoy. Now, once again, you don't want to just say what would make a good museum visit, because of course children don't know what all the possibilities are. You need to give them some parameters. But maybe, and we found with the youth that we worked with, we could also talk to them about when they were 10, because our study was starting with 10-year-olds. And they could talk to us about, well, when I was 10, I liked this and I did this. But really try to get information from them directly. And then related to this school bit, I also think that we tend to just say, come on and we'll help you. You know, and it's part of that egalitarian stuff, and we feel like we need to help the schools. But I think they need to meet us halfway more often, and that we need to be more tough about the use of our resources. And so some thoughts are that you differentiate children that come and maybe get a self-guide, and you allow them to use your resource, but you use your precious expertise, the educational expertise that you have, to work with teachers and schools that are willing and want deeper, lengthier visits. As we visited, several people were saying, well, it's so hard, we only have this much time. Well, in the US, some institutions are experimenting with saying, you know, the ideal experience is 3 hours. And we want you, you know, we'd love for you to make that commitment. And then the people that are willing to make that commitment do. They don't say no to the other schools, but they use their expertise for that 3-hour visit. There are also institutions in the States that are working on multiple visit programs, building that relationship over time, because we know if children come more frequently, that's really important. And related to both of those ideas is also connecting back to the family in some way. Some institutions have been experimenting with children doing something at the museum and then going back to the school and maybe creating an exhibition of some kind, and then inviting the families to come. And the children are curators, and people from the museum come. Some institutions, I mentioned the Oakland Museum yesterday that hired youth to do oral histories. They let the youth create an exhibition in the museum and then invited the parents to come and be a part of that and see the work that their children had done. So real briefly, I just want to share some research. So that was sort of the beginning bit about how we can be more engaging. Some research about facilitation, because this is also an area where we have great expertise, but we also sometimes, you know, can get overzealous about, you know, we can get overzealous about our collections, and we can get overzealous about teaching so that we sort of forget what our role is. One of my students did this work for his master's degree. His name's Scott Pattison, and he was really interested in 2 areas in the museum that are lab spaces. And one is a chemistry lab, one is a physics lab. And what he was most interested in was all those unstructured interactions that family visitors have with staff. And by the way, he has decided, and we've been playing with this in some publications, he talks about staff, paid and unpaid, rather than trying to make that distinction between staff and volunteers. And they've been using this inside the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. And it seems to be empowering their volunteers to feel like they're more a part of the staff. They just happen not to be paid as staff do. These were very open-ended spaces. And what he wanted to look at is how do these moments when staff say hello, which is interesting, only 2 of the people, he videotaped interactions. He ended up choosing, he had about 60 sets of video of interactions. He chose 42 to analyze in great detail, and only 2 of the facilitators actually introduced themselves and said hello and welcomed people, which we heard about that yesterday, how important that is. What did he find out? Well, first of all, what he found out is most of these families, because they were already in the space, were already interacting. And actually, there was a facilitator for the family, usually the adult, but by the way, not always. Sometimes it was the child. And they were the gatekeeper to the success of at least this interaction with the facilitator. And that, in fact, what was really important was that this facilitator not ignore or step in front of or try to take over facilitation that was already happening. And they were gatekeepers because if the new facilitator coming up was ignored or only partially acknowledged, the interaction didn't go well. And actually, and let me tell you, it was very vivid. Parents turned their back on facilitators. The other really interesting thing, there was a bit of a power struggle going on. Visitors, often adults, finished the sentences of the facilitators. They wanted to show that they knew the answers. And something that was really interesting was that often what the facilitator wanted to do was teach the person about science, when in fact what the family was doing was having a more open-ended experience. And this was really vivid in one set of video. The mother was a physicist, and which speaks to those different audiences that we don't think about. One of the physics activities was playing with glasses with different levels of water in them. The facilitator comes up and wants to teach why this is happening, and the physicist's mother says he wants to play and hear the different sounds. And it's really fascinating, you know, the agenda for what that visit was about and what it meant. So it really speaks to, as we think about facilitation, and as we think about people, in this case, who are coming, they come as a learning community already. As I said, they know one another. And what's really great, what's wonderful, is that Scott works in this institution. And what he's been able to do of late is he's actually working with the staff at the institution. And what he's teaching them is the best way they can facilitate sometimes is not to, is to realize great things are happening, or to support the facilitation that the adult or the child is doing. So to become a co-facilitator. I know I need to really hurry here, so I'm gonna sort of really quickly, I'm just echoing what my co-presenter said, that if we want to understand experience, if we want to understand identity, And if we want to understand who's not visiting, we need to listen and we need to understand the needs and the wishes. And I would say the aspirations, in the same way that you want to understand the needs of the community. I mean, what do people wish for? And how could the museum be a part of helping them accomplish those wishes? And it's about qualitative research. We haven't talked about this, but I am very happy to share this presentation. We talked a little bit about Stephen Weil yesterday. Mar shared some of his quotes. This is a lovely quote just about this notion that that what's really important for museums, oh, I left dots up there, sorry, is that they matter and that they actually make a difference in people's lives. And this gets very much to what Yetta was saying at the end of her conversation. And this is this notion of the importance of the public value of our institutions, and that we think about social learning goals as being equally important. This frame is about thinking about impact for and with communities, you know, that finding out what aspirations, what needs are, rather than thinking about the institution. Because frankly, if we start from the institution, we often decide that what's most important is for the community to have a healthy and vital museum. Well, the museum should be a means to what end? And I would argue that one end is public value. Why now? We've talked a lot about the context for museums right now. Actually, what's interesting in the US is, you know, we're having to reevaluate and look at our focus and realize that we've moved away from some core values. And museums have been a part of that. In the US, there's a business model, and actually I'm a firm believer that museums need to be run like businesses, but we have to remember what business we're in, and we're not selling widgets. And we know we're being asked by government, by funders, and frankly by the public, and legitimately so, why we're important. And we should be able to give an answer. And that answer may not be as compelling, that we have these really important objects and we're trying to preserve heritage. You know, particularly if you're from a community that doesn't feel like your heritage is a part of that institution. And I think something that has been said in this room is that we may not be as relevant as we like to think that we are at times. I'm going to whip through some stuff here, but you will have it. But it's really this idea of thinking about who's your audience, what are their needs, and how do you know their needs? It's very easy sitting back, you know, and saying, oh, people need this. You need to talk to people themselves. And they may not be able to, that's not something that people necessarily think about. But you need to think of ways to talk to people, once again, about their needs, their wishes, their aspirations. If you're wanting to work with children and with families, a great thing is to ask people, what are their aspirations for their children? That can be a real window in, particularly with communities that are not, you know, that are not traditionally using museums. I'm going to skip through that just to share with you also thinking about your outcomes. We tend to say, well, the outcome is that you learned about art or you appreciate art. But the Urban Institute in the US has been actually looking at community indicators. and trying to help cultural and frankly not-for-profit organizations in general to think about what are broader outcomes that have public value. And I pulled out, they have an outcome indicators project. And by the way, they've set this up so that those indicators are on their website and they give you steps for how to use them. But there were 4 areas that I thought lend themselves potentially to museums. Adult education and family literacy, health risk reduction, youth mentoring, and then tutoring are 4 areas that one could sort of hang one's hat on as being a resource for. Okay, 2 minutes, great. So let me share real fast some data with you. And I want to reinforce something that we've said to, that got mentioned a bit by John, but this notion of long-term impacts and really trying to step back and say what influence have these had. Data from 2 different studies, all by the way with communities that don't traditionally use museums. I wanted to share some of the impacts that were observed long-term that were not the usual suspects of outcomes. We've got independence and autonomy around learning. Learning to interact with others, getting along and learning to collaborate. And these, by the way, thinking back to that school visit, these are all goals that actually schools don't always do that well. I think that's another strategy for us as we try to build a case for ourselves vis-a-vis school, is that maybe we complement, rather than supplement, we complement and bring skills to the table that aren't school-oriented. Real quickly, guess what? These were programs for youth, but they engaged the family. There were outcomes for adults, too. And outcomes around better understanding the importance of supporting a child's learning. An enhanced sense of sharing time together. Actually, we were working with really poor families, and they don't have a lot of, it's so easy for middle class, upper class people to talk about quality time. What about time? I'm almost done. Yeah, other people have had a little bit more time, and I did stand up. I'm going to push back a bit, yeah. And then I just wanted to share, I just finished a study where we tracked down young women 5 to 25 plus years after they participated in an intensive program that was focused on science. Not all of the programs were museum-based, but a few were. And I just wanted to say a couple, 3 things. Women had lasting and detailed memories of these experiences years later, and it didn't matter how long it had been, the memories were just as salient and just as detailed if it had been 25 years ago or 5 years ago. These are powerful experiences. They did contribute. Thank God the National Science Foundation funded this project in the US. They did contribute to learning science broadly, and I can, if anyone's interested in that, you can ask. And then they also contributed to shaping and building women's social capital and their personal identity. So that's my presentation. I just want to give you my assignment. And it's going to be out on the table also. So I'd like you in your group to discuss 1 to 2 ideas, and you can break up into smaller. Some of you are here from institutions, and if you want to be very focused, I'm giving you an extra day. I want you to be thinking about, when you get back to work on Thursday, how could you connect respectfully and innovatively, both to visitors or take on those people who don't visit. By the way, I hate the word non-visitors. I like to call them people who are not visiting or using. But anyway, you can focus. These were just ideas, a way to more actively engage people, support the resources, identities, and motivations that people are bringing themselves, or thinking about how you frame your institution within the fabric of the community. And then one final thing, and by the way, please write this down because the agency really wants to get this, and you'll see why in a moment. To be successful, what would you need from yourself? Remember, pushing ourselves, as Martha so eloquently talked about this morning. What do you need in terms of your institution and the changes you might need? And what could the Agency for Culture do to support your efforts? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.